Pleased now to be joined by Yemi Olagbaya, who is Client Solutions Director at Softwire, and we're going to be discussing Agentic AI, the promise and perils of autonomous decision-making. We hear a lot about AI agents at the moment and this morning, and that is, and maybe we can define it a little bit, but AI that goes beyond chatbots to sort of have some autonomy over decision-making and executing tasks outside the chat window, etc. We hear a lot about how they're going to transform businesses, but what does that actually look like? How should businesses approach preparing for a world in which agents join the workforce, and what questions do agents raise about trust, risk, responsibility? So I'm very happy to have you here, Yemi, to discuss this with you. Maybe you could just start by giving the audience a little bit of insight into your background and role, just to contextualize your perspective on this.
Sure, yes. Hello, everyone. So I am a Client Solutions Director at Softwire. We're a technology transformation, digital optimization partner, sort of consultancy and delivery. And I guess my background, I sort of have come from a business development background, but then over the years have kind of led into being more of a sort of a technologist and a consultant, if you will, I guess. Would consider myself probably the sort of chief evangelist, I guess, within my organization around AI and all things AI, and kind of carry out a lot of activity these days in kind of helping organizations figure out AI strategy and AI transformation through a combination of sort of, consultancy and workshops and such.
Great. So helping organizations think about agents and things like that. What is an AI agent? Let's start there, because I think sometimes these things can be defined so broadly as to be, almost equivalent to computing at some stages. What is the sort of key transformation here that matters?
Yeah, so I guess maybe one way to start is actually saying what AI agents are not. So it's very different to kind of the standardized sort of one-shot prompting flow that I think most of us do in ChatGPT. You give it a sort of a thing to do, and it spits you out that output, and it's kind of a very quick feedback loop, I guess, with getting that response. I think AI agents are, it's more than the AI being able to analyze and to predict. It's kind of moving over into this world where, as you sort of implied, Jeremy, the AI is able to act, right? So we've got the sort of the understand bit, right? Here's the prompts that I'm giving in. We've got the think, or the sort of the planning and the reasoning, and then we're now moving over into this world where the AI can act, it can make decisions, on your behalf or on its own. So it's kind of moving, I guess, from this kind of smart advisor role to something more akin to an autonomous agent, but more akin to almost an employee, a co-worker within your organization. One of the ways that I explain it to people is that it's a bit like, if AI is the brain, with Agentic AI, we've now moved to AI now having a body that allows it to sort of move and act in the world alongside us, which is really exciting, but obviously, as I'm sure we'll come on to, there's some perils with that.
And so what sort of opportunities does this open up practically for companies? Do you have any good real-world examples, maybe early examples in particular industries where this can slot into it quite effectively?
So I think we're still at the early stages of it, right? So I don't think there are swathes of examples out there, but equally, though, I think there are some companies doing some really interesting things. There's the obvious example of sort of process automation and such, and it's worth saying that this is the thing with the hype, is that actually I think that Agentic AI is kind of a building of lots of the things that we've had over the last few years, and it's coming to that sort of tipping point, if you will. So data, algorithms, compute, integration capabilities. But some of the more interesting examples that I see, if you look at the retail world, you've got companies like Olay and Sephora that are having these AI agents that are able to almost do like a sort of customer service, upselling, cross-selling type thing. So I think it's Sephora specifically. No, I'm probably getting them mixed around. But one of them has the ability to basically analyze the customer's sort of skin profile and start recommending different sort of products based on what that profile is. I think if you look at the sports world as well, the NFL are kind of integrating this with IoT and giving the ability to analyze the behavior of sports players, the athletes on field, and in real time give some feedback on the performance, specific plays, maybe even preventing injuries as well, with that sort of IoT linkage in there. So I think there's lots of examples and lots of sort of possibility, but I would say that it still feels like we're very much at the early stage of figuring out not just what those opportunities are, but how to govern or mitigate risk, I guess, when doing so.
Because I think that's the funny thing about agents is that its strength, which is that you can give off abilities to someone else, you can cede control. That's as well its vulnerability, right? So what are some of the risks that come with letting go of some control to AI agents?
So I tried to put this in sort of an anecdote the other day. I don't think that the risk that we have with these things is kind of the sort of Terminator style, like AI gone rogue. I actually think that the biggest risk isn't that sort of evil side of things. It's more just that the agentic AI, does exactly what we tell it to do, right? Because the thing with these things is, so I quite like to use parenting analogy because most of my life feels like it's parenting these days with my two young daughters. But it feels like there is a strong parenting analogy here, right? Where you have your child and your child sort of grows with these new capabilities, right? All of a sudden it can walk, it can crawl, talk. Sorry, not it. He or she. And with those new capabilities, that's exciting, right, as a parent. But with that comes some new risks. And with each of those new capabilities, as your child grows, you need to make sure that you are putting in place the right sort of governance framework, if you will, as a parent, to understand and to be able to sort of check and balance along the way what your child is doing. So I think one of the biggest risks is kind of defining the exact sort of guardrails around what the agentic AI is doing, making sure that that's really fundamentally clear. You can imagine a scenario where an AI kind of really overly over-indexes on a specific metric, right, without understanding the contextual side of the business, right, the hidden, unspoken values or ethics within that business that might seem obvious to you but aren't obvious to the AI. If we translate, I was saying to someone outside earlier, if you translate that to the parenting analogy, I could tell my eldest daughter to go and clean her room, and she might basically just grab a bunch of stuff and shove it under the bed. Now, technically, she's kind of cleaned her room, but not really, because there's still a bunch of crap underneath the bed. So it's about how specific you can be about the scope of what's going on. But I think it's also about making sure that you've got the right checks and balances along the way, so that you're maintaining that sort of human in the loop governance and oversight, rather than just kind of letting these things run wild. Very quickly, the other analogy I sort of like to put in here is it's like autonomous driving, right? We've got cars that have driver assist and in some cases can do the full-blown sort of self-pilot thing. That's great. In fact, it's actually pretty fascinating, right? But then what happens when there is a kind of random bit of like unexpected weather, a tornado or something, or there are some roads that have like kind of different conditions that the car isn't used to? All of a sudden then we need to kind of have the human stepping back into play to kind of take control of the situation. So, yeah.
And it raises interesting questions around accountability of decision-making. That's coming through in the Slido questions here, right? If an autonomous AI agent goes wrong, e.g. an autonomous car runs over a child by misinterpreting, who is accountable? Is it the car owner, the car company, parents, or someone else? You've got to think about this from a kind of governance, compliance, accountability perspective, as well as everything else.
Yeah, and I think, I'll be honest, I don't have sort of the most fine-tuned answer here, but I think as we move further into this AI agentic world, it's about role definition. It's about giving someone the specific ownership of that role. And that might be your chief AI officer, it might be the business unit leader, whoever. But I think that it's kind of making sure that it is someone's explicit responsibility rather than governance being this kind of checkbox thing that is a layer across the entire organization. Because without that ownership, you can't create that accountability.
If organizations are going to think about raising AI agents like they're raising children and then bringing them into the organization, what does that sort of onboarding process look like beyond maybe that governance framework? Presumably there's quite a lot they're going to need to do in terms of getting their sort of infrastructure and ways of working ready, right? Because this is something that more directly sort of substitutes for tasks and roles, and it's going to require a bit more of a rethink about how organizations are structured. How should companies start thinking about approaching that?
So I think that, there's so many, so many things to bring in here, right? As you've implied, I think there's the sort of the data and architecture and infrastructure side of things, and I think specifically it's about that being adaptable, right, to the sort of multitude of situations that will eventually sort of unfold. And the usual story of making sure that your data is in check. I think that it's also about that continuous governing process, much like I sort of said with the kids. In fact, to give an example, right, what you don't want with your child is to kind of get to the end of the school year and then you find out that your child has flunked their classes or whatever. You want to have regular checkpoints along the way to kind of make sure that you're able to continuously audit and kind of adapt to the progress they're making. And I think it's a similar thing with AI, because what happens if there is some hidden bias, for example, in the data that you're pumping into the agentic AI? And obviously, like we've said, this is leaving these autonomous agents to kind of go off and do a bunch of stuff on their own. And so you want to be able to kind of have checkpoints in there to make sure that that isn't kind of making an exponential sort of adverse effect on whatever the output is. But also you want some transparency and some auditability within there, and you can only do that by having that sort of regular process through. I think there's also a change management piece, right? Because I think, with my visionary hat on, and I think someone sort of alluded to it in the panel before, I can see a world where in maybe 5 years, maybe more 10 years, we think of AI agents as co-workers, right, within our organizations, and we're adopting them, we're onboarding them in the same way that we would onboard employees, right? So you hire an AI agent for your organization, you give it not only the data, but also the policies and the kind of the context of how the business is run. And I think what that means is then you've got a whole bunch of people who are working with AI co-workers. And so there's a change management piece of, well, how do they adapt to that new sort of working style and their sort of their robot colleagues, if you will?
Yeah, I think that sooner or later you go from that sort of substitutive work to thinking about looking at your organization as a whole. How are we creating value? What is our process? And what if you could slot in that capability?
Yeah, exactly. But I think also, just to sort of build on that, the how organizations deliver value, I think, is the really interesting thing. And again, in the panel before, someone just said, I think there's a real opportunity, obviously balanced with the risks, an opportunity to almost rethink how your organization is able to deliver value, to give your employees the inspiration to understand what more can they do with that time that is given to them. I often talk to people about there being sort of a three-wave sort of horizon model here, right? And we're kind of probably, I guess, coming out of wave one, which is, cool, we've got this technology, let's start automating some stuff, right? Great. When you move into phase two, we're then starting to talk about, well, how do you start to enhance the quality of those outputs, right, of the automation or the things that you're applying to the AI. But where it gets really interesting is wave three, which is thinking about your organization in an AI native mindset, right? And that means that, there might be some revision of existing business models or ways that you do things, how you operate, but also completely new ways to operate and to deliver value to your customers. And that feels really exciting.
As you say, it's still quite early because these examples are very nascent, but you can kind of see the direction of travel if it works out. And some of these issues around data privacy and the connections of these agents to our sort of raw root systems, etc., is going to be troubling. But what should organizations who are thinking that far ahead, thinking about going to that third wave, be doing in terms of preparing their data, their infrastructure for an entirely different way of organizing their work?
This is possibly going to sound like a bit of a cop-out answer, but I think it's just about being proactive and having a bunch of this stuff done by design from the beginning, from the outset, rather than thinking reactively. And that's why with that three-wave horizon model, I try to get customers and clients I'm speaking to as quickly as possible think out of wave one and sort of look as far down the line, because what you don't want is to wait until some sort of a scandal happens where you've had some sort of a data thing or a bias thing or whatever. You want to be on the front foot of that. In the same way, you kind of want to be on the front foot of anything bad or negative that your child might do. And that's the approach that most people take to parenting, right? Is that it's a by design thing, is that I'm raising a child and I want that child to be a decent human being in this planet. And so I'm baking all of these things right from the beginning of their sort of early childhood into later life. So do everything sort of by design from the beginning, basically.
Good advice. All right. Thank you very much, Yemi. Good to chat.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So agents are both children and co-workers. Have I got that right? Sort of. There we are. Can I please now introduce Eddie and John from Google to talk about AI policy. Eddie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this Fireside chat on AI policy. We're joined by John Steinberg, who is the Director of Global Policy Campaigns at Google and probably very well placed, one of the best placed people to talk about AI policy. Now, as you know, governments started working on AI policy quite some time before the world really saw generative AI in action. There were drafts, there were plans, and then the big models, Google's Gemini, OpenAI's ChatGPT, came into the world, surprised us, and the need for policy became even more urgent than before. So my first question to John is, where are we now, and what is happening with the wider AI policy initiatives across the world?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I think you described very well this sort of journey that policymakers have been on. I spent a lot of time focused on European policymaking, so was very involved in our work around the AI Act, and you described it very well. So we were on this, taking this approach around thinking about what the opportunities of AI are, what the potential risks are, and how to manage that. And the AI Act was very much drafted with that kind of mindset. And then Gemini, ChatGPT happened. And there was a shift. And there was it was a reflection of what we all saw in the public debate. You read it in the newspapers, the godfathers of AI intervening, raising concerns about the risks. And then you saw that reflected in how policymakers responded. So we had the Bletchley Park summit that the former prime minister hosted, very much focused on risk. And then the follow-up summit in Seoul last year, again, very much focused on safety and risk. Where I think we are now, and again, very much reflected in the debate and the language that we heard in Paris, was, if it is a pendulum, a swing back towards the opportunity, right?
Yep.
And the actions that governments can take to really seize the opportunity. Because from our perspective, I would say two things are fundamental to our approach to AI and policy. First of all, that as our CEO Sundar has said a number of times, AI is too important not to regulate, but too important not to regulate well. Mm-hmm. With that, we think it's really important that we understand the transformational moment that we're in, that this technology is going to have, the opportunity that's going to have for all of us, in our businesses, in our societies, whether that's scientific discovery, healthcare, the way that governments can solve problems for their citizens. So this shift to thinking a bit more about how you seize that opportunity, we think is really great.
Yep.
And that's, I'd say, generally where we are today.
That sounds really good. We'll move towards what does Google do to help policymakers.
Sure.
But before we get there, can you just tell us a little bit more about the difference in approach? For instance, the EU AI Act is really focused on risks. They have these 4 risk categories, whereas, as you're saying, now the discourse is changing a little bit in the UK. We saw a little bit of this in Paris towards opportunities.
Yeah.
What can we get out of it? What do you think is the better way about it from your sort of model maker perspective?
Yeah. So in general, what I would say is we're very supportive of regulation that takes a risk-based approach. So the fundamental framework of the AI Act, we've been supportive of, and we were very active participants in that debate in a constructive way, where Google was never a company that was saying there should be no AI regulation in Europe. Where we get concerned is when regulation departs from that risk-based approach. And that's what we have also seen in Europe, is in the final stages of the debate of the AI Act, they introduced a separate category of rules around what they call GPI, or general purpose AI. So essentially, that's the largest models. So you can think OpenAI or Google or Meta or others, but also European models, Mistral, Aleph Alpha, et cetera. And what they basically essentially said is that these models are so big that they need their own class of rules because they are inherently risky. We disagree. We think that when you depart from that risk-based approach, that's when you run the risk of closing your market off from the innovation, the growth, and the opportunity that's possible. And what I would say is that over the course of the last year, for sure, governments around the world have looked at the AI Act because it is the first piece of legislation that has come out so comprehensively. And governments are thinking twice before copying and pasting. So you saw earlier this year, the UK government launched their UK AI action plan, which is really about seizing the opportunities within government to inspire, stimulate, and enable AI innovation and growth. So that whether that's around data centers, around energy, around the regulatory, the policy landscape around AI, so privacy, copyright, et cetera, how can we unlock that growth and innovation? And the same can be said of the Japanese approach, the approach that's being taken in Singapore, and in a framework that ASEAN recently published. And so there is while we overall think the more that governments have interoperable approaches across countries, this shift towards thinking more about how you can seize the opportunity, we think is really positive.
Right. But there's still certain value in the risk-based approach, right?
Yeah.
So what are the ways in which a risk-based approach, similar to what the EU is doing, especially about these larger models, can actually help you? Is there a space where, pushier regulation actually insulates companies for probably responsibility a couple of years down the line?
Well, I think any business likes certainty for planning. I mean, for all of you in the audience, I'm sure whatever field that you're in, you want a stable investment environment, you want a stable regulatory environment, you want to understand, as you're thinking about your product pipeline, your innovation pipeline, how you're going to develop and deploy whatever it is that you do, the more that you have certainty, the easier it is for you to plan. So the overall risk-based approach is sensible. There are certain things, for those that aren't familiar with it, that are just outright banned. Yep. So you can't use AI for social scoring, for example. We think that's sensible. We have no argument about that. Then there is a set of things that are high risk. And really, as long as what you're doing there is focusing on the outputs of what AI does, we think that's the right way to approach it. What we also encourage governments to do, though, is to remember that things that are unlawful or regulated in the technology space in other ways are often still regulated even if AI is applied.
Yeah.
So you don't necessarily need a new set of rules just because AI is now on the field. You need to look at your existing regulation and how it can apply. Because I think in general, if we step out of the policy debate and the politics of AI, particularly in Europe, but I think this is increasingly true around the world, there's a real focus on competitiveness. How do we think about, growth in many parts of the world is stagnant. How can we as governments, or how can governments, I should say, think about how they can stimulate growth? And so, as Mario Draghi very famously has, published his report last year for the European Union, regulation and overly burdensome regulation, overlapping regulation, is a hindrance to growth.
Yeah.
And so let's be sensible not to just pile on more rules.
Right. So that's a fairly optimistic picture of how AI policy and objectives of many governments right now.
I'd like to be optimistic.
I think we should, but we also need to be careful about some of the trickier bits. For instance, you said that we are currently really focusing on the outputs of AI, but many people have raised questions on whether there should be regulation in terms of how these models actually come to be, because they, as we all know, are not the most transparent pieces of tech.
Sure.
So do you think that that type of policy has any merit in the current environment?
I think when it comes to transparency, absolutely there is some merit to having transparency about how models are built. I think what we are mindful, however, is when those obligations potentially threaten trade secrets, competitive advantage, the way that models are built, the source of the data that go into them, the technology or the tools and techniques that are used in model training and fine-tuning and grounding, the energy consumption around them, all of those things are areas in which model labs are competing with each other.
Yep.
So I think what we want to be careful about is that those transparency obligations don't stand in the way of that competitiveness, of the competition that's happening, I should say, between the models.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense. And we actually have a question from the audience which relates to this, which is whether companies like Google will need to include inherent guardrails to their AI products in the future. So the focus here is rather on the other side.
Yeah.
If regulators don't require certain things, what are you guys doing?
Sure. I mean, it's not will they, it's are we? And the answer is yes. So we've had, we first published a set of principles about how we're developing AI within Google that governs what our product teams and our research and developers can do. I won't get the date right, but I would say we're talking 2018, 2019, even earlier potentially, and we're very public about those. We've blogged about them. We publish an annual report about that because we absolutely believe in AI safety and responsibility. The sort of mantra within Google is that we want to take a bold and responsible approach to developing AI. So absolutely there are obligations on companies, whether or not there's regulation forcing us to. We absolutely need to take responsibility for that governance.
This sounds reassuring. Now, I'll ask the audience to think of sharp questions for John.
Sure.
And for now, I'll ask him, while you do that, what are the things that businesses should be thinking about in terms of policy from your very specific perspective as model builders?
Yeah.
What should people in the room remember when they get out of here?
So I think my number one message is join us in the debate. Policymakers are looking at this technology, and what we want to be careful about is that they don't take a narrow view of only thinking about what developers of AI technology are doing and how that's governed. Because what really is going to matter in terms of the transformational nature of AI is how it's deployed. And whether you and your company are building models for yourself or working with partners to deploy AI across your businesses, you have an interest in this debate. And it's really important that policymakers hear from you. If this debate is contained only between policymakers and a handful of companies, I don't think that will lead to positive outcomes.
Yeah.
And so we really want to encourage companies, whether that's in their own voice or working through their trade associations or whatever the appropriate way might be, is to understand that you have a real interest in the outcomes of these policy debates and your voice is really valuable in it.
Yeah, and I want to follow up on this because the general public also does. It's not just the business leaders. What do you think is the role of just public opinion and the general people in that policy debate?
Well, I mean, I'm a big fan of representative government, so I think it's important that elected governments are representing the interests of their citizens, and every country has a different way in which that sort of plays out. So I think it's absolutely important that policymakers are in touch with what their constituents think. I think, and I don't mean this as in any way to suggest that there's a caveat to that. I just think what we also want to be mindful of is that we don't regulate a hype cycle.
Yeah.
And that's true for any technology. And I'll share one very brief anecdote. I've been at Google for a long time. So I was at Google when our self-driving car technology first started to become a thing. And I can very, very clearly remember going to a meeting with an unnamed transport ministry where they said, well, we're going to write a law about how self-driving car technology should be governed in our country. And this was like before the technology was proven, before any self-driving cars were being tested on the road, before there was a commercial strategy for how they would be deployed. I mean, sure, policymakers should be thinking about new technology and how legislative frameworks should work for them, but let's not jump before we even understand what the technology does.
Yeah. So this is where I assume you'd say you guys can help government figure out what to do.
Absolutely.
Now, who has questions in the room? Lady over there, do we have a mic somewhere? Yes, come in.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. Brilliant insights, and thanks for sharing. A couple of questions, they're kind of connected. One is that how do you see ESG playing out in the AI arena? And second is, what is the level of authority where you feel you'll have to be completely transparent, and you'll have to show everything that is behind the model?
So I'll be honest, I don't have a particularly insightful answer to the first question, but happy to chat during the lunch break if we have a moment. I think there is as I said, if governments moved in a direction of complete transparency around the way that AI models are built, that's going to make it very unattractive to develop or deploy AI technology in that market. That's just the truth. And I think the complexity of regulation is already a hindrance to the development and deployment of AI products and services in markets. So in Europe, if you look at the broad swath of regulation that impacts technology, there is a reason why companies like Google, like OpenAI, like Meta, and others are choosing to launch products in Europe later. So there are, we're launching a product in Europe that has been available in the UK for a while now called AI Overviews, and that will be coming to Europe soon. It's been in America for, I think, over a year now.
Yeah.
So I think that's the risk, is that we just won't seize the opportunity in markets where if regulation is that prescriptive.
I want to follow up on a question that was submitted through Slido, which relates to this, which was, are governments creating an AI war by deregulation? Is there such a risk, given the discrepancy between regions that you just described?
I wouldn't say that they're creating a war of deregulation. I think perhaps some friendly tension or competition about where is the best place to develop and deploy this technology is perhaps a healthy thing. But as I was saying, we are advocating for interoperable approaches across governments. And so one of the things that we were very active in is the G7 published a set of principles around AI regulation, which we think are very sensible. And so if G7 countries and others use that as inspiration for how they think about it in their market, that's a positive thing. I mean, I think Google is not alone in liking scale.
Yeah.
And so the more that we can build once and deploy across markets, that's obviously good for us, but that's true for many of the businesses in the room, I'm sure.
Great. This has been incredibly insightful. A lot of food for thought. Now we have food for nutrition in the lunch break. But beforehand, please join me in applauding John.
Thank you.